everyone, it's Patricia. Welcome back to the Bad Chinese Teacher Podcast. How are y'all doing? I'm doing all right. It's been a rough week. I feel like I'm this swamp creature that is just now crawling out of my grad school nightmare application hellhole. It's been a rough couple of weeks, guys. For those of you in a similar boat, grad school applications are due in the next couple of weeks. I'm trying to get all of them done in the next 2 days, because I'm leaving for a trip right on Christmas Day. So 3 days from now, and I just really got to get all this stuff out before I leave. Otherwise, it's just not going to get done. And it's been hard, you guys. I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, all my seniors, in high school seniors are also finishing up that process. So there is this nice kind of sense of camaraderie that they're suffering. I'm also suffering. But man, when you're 26 years old and you're I don't know. My issue is I'm applying to schools and I'm legitimately looking at my list, looking at my GPA, looking at my test scores. I'm just I could legitimately get into 0 schools. And that thought just kind of shakes me to my core. But anyway, it's got to get done, got to stay focused. But it's been kind of nice to kind of step away for just a second to sit down and talk to you guys, talk to you about the end of the year. Happy Christmas for those of you who celebrate. But with Christmas also comes Christmas break, which just started for me on Friday, a couple of days ago. Doesn't feel like it because, again, life has been hard. But it's a good time to kind of wrap up my thoughts about the semester. Technically, the semester for our school doesn't end for another 2 weeks after we get back from break. A lot of schools end right around Christmas break and have a long Christmas break, and then they go back into spring semester. Our school does not do that. Our school is finishing up the last 2 weeks of the semester and then ending it off in the end-ish of January. But for all intents and purposes, this does kind of feel like the end of the semester. And, now's as good a time as ever to reflect. And one thing I really wanted to spend some time reflecting on is the specific teaching methodology I've employed over the past semester. This semester was kind of the first time I started using this method in earnest. Started kind of toying with it for the latter half of the second semester last year. But this year I really kind of committed to it and, figured that 4 months in, it's a good time to reassess. And so the method I'm talking about is called TPRS, which stands for Teaching Proficiency Through Reading and Storytelling. We actually talked about this in depth back on episode 6 when Rachel Casella was on. Rachel Casella is my friend who teaches Spanish and French at a public school, a couple of minutes down, and she's been using TPRS for quite some time. And so, we fangirled over it. It's worth fangirling over. By and large, the past 4 months have been a really good 4 months for me teaching wise. TPRS is something that has been around in the teaching world for quite some time, but I think if you're around my age, and or you've been learning languages for quite some time, you might not have heard of this or might not have seen a teacher who has used this, which is kind of strange because, again, this TPRS has been around since the 90s. But the thing is that the rollout for it has been, it's kind of it kind of feels like Fight Club. There's actually a Facebook group of teachers who do TPRS that is called, and the Facebook group is actually called CI, Comprehensible Input Fight Club, which I find kind of funny and cute. But if you know, you know. And so TPRS has kind of changed how I view my classroom, and it will probably always kind of define my view of how I teach, just because it's been so effective and I've seen so much success from it, even from my kind of, amateur novice sort of approach to it. I'm not a one-person department, but I am the only person in my department that teaches Chinese. And so a lot of what I do teaching-wise, methodology-wise, has kind of been me sort of throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. Talked about this, a little while back on another episode, I think episode 7, about my internal angst with that and the idea that I'm using all these opportunities to really experiment and as a new teacher and I feel a little guilty sometimes because I feel like I'm experimenting with my students' actual education, and that it's not a super great place to be in, but I feel like without that process you don't really get good. And so TPRS using TPRs this semester is the first time I've actually felt super competent in what I'm doing, feeling a lot more confident, and also feeling like I'm being supported, not necessarily because I have, a tribe of other Chinese teachers at my school with me, but because TPRS, the teachers who do it are really into it and really dedicated to it and are really generous with their ideas and their materials. And so it's been a really good 4 months so far, but I just wanted to talk about that. For those of you who are, this will be super helpful to you if you are a Chinese teacher looking to employ TPRS. I think that's something that there is, in the Chinese teacher forums I've seen. That's a question that keeps coming up. Like, what is TPRS? How do I use it? How do I implement it for Chinese? Because it does take a different form than it does for other languages. And so, I don't know how many of those there are out there, but hey, if you're a Chinese teacher like me and you've heard of TPRS and you're intrigued, listen on. If you are a student, I think this is still going to be of some value to you because there are some larger overarching philosophical questions about TPRS that come into play when you're talking about learning a language, whether you're a self-studier or you're someone who's taking classes, and it comes down to the whys and the motivations. But I'll talk about that in a bit. So TPRS I first heard about when I was interviewing for a position about a year ago, and the position was at this I won't name the name of the school, but it's a super elite, very expensive, very well-known prep school in Manhattan, New York. And not only that, its world language program is not its flagship program, but it's graduated a couple of people who are actually pretty well known for their language ability. So this is nothing. This is not some shoddy program that, is living in some backcountry wood and has never, has not gone to a single world language teaching conference in their lives. This is a pretty well-known school. And so I heard about this from this school because the teacher I was interviewing it with had said, she was like, oh, I've heard of this thing called TPRS. We're testing it out, seeing how it works. You might want to also look into it. So this is not we've done this for 15 years. It's great. We're experts at this. This is a elite Manhattan prep school who is we're just trying this out, right? So, TPRS, like I said, has been around for forever, but it still feels quite new, especially if you've been in teaching environments that have worked just fine, quote unquote, using legacy methods. So it's kind of almost as if TPRS doesn't really come into the equation unless legacy methods start to not work so well, right? If you're in an environment where legacy methods work really well, TPRS doesn't really tend to come into the picture because, why, if it ain't broke, why fix it, right? So it was interesting to me that this school, that this Manhattan, private school, was considering TPRS, especially given the high aptitude of their student population, how self-motivated they must be. But this kind of was an indicator to me that this methodology holds its own merit on its own, rather than just being this is a hack into teaching Chinese. It's starting to really gain, real mainstream acceptance and implementation. And for those reasons, we should really pay attention to it. But anyway, TPRS was developed in the 90s by Blaine Ray, who's a teacher, and his methodology was built off of an even earlier method called TPR, which stands for total physical response. So same letters, different words. TPR has been around for even longer, and basically the methodology behind TPR is that you associate vocabulary words with physical motions, which is just really a fancy way to say, if you're going to teach the word eat, right? 吃 in Chinese, as you're saying 吃, you're making a hand motion that looks like you are eating, right? And so the logic behind that is that rather than having students learn vocabulary and, ergo grammar in a way that's just kind of this means this, blah, blah, blah. You're keeping students in the target language and you're having them associate words with, the universality of motions. The emphasis on both TPRS and TPR is that it emphasizes understanding rather than the student's output. So they prioritize students being able to understand new vocabulary, new grammar, blah, 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 rather than putting a focus on having students produce stuff, whether it be spoken speech or written work or whatever. They're really focused on, amongst the four modalities, listening and reading, right? Because those are, that's input, right? And so the overarching kind of philosophy behind both TPR, TPRS, as well as a litany of other, similar sort of approaches is called comprehensible input, or CI. And this is contrasting to the communicative method, which is really kind of like, again, like I said before, it's focusing on a student's ability to output and therefore communicate with others. And again, if you're like me and you were taught in largely legacy style, like, classrooms, you might be hearing, this might sound somewhat familiar to you because you're kind of like, the way that I was taught, it was kind of like language is meant to be used. And so what the student is able to say and write in order to communicate is really important, because communication is a two-way street. You can't communicate unless you are outputting stuff. And so, this kind of doesn't really fly in the face of that, but it definitely kind of tips us on its head, because rather than expecting students to kind of output stuff, they're just really focused on having students understand. Which was interesting to me, because in my gut, I was like, well, if they're just sitting back and passively like understanding, well, I can do that too. I'm a heritage speaker of Chinese. That's like easy for me. And so why then did I have to spend so much work and effort to learn Chinese if communication is supposed to be the key here? I'll talk about that in a little bit. But in my initial gut reaction, TPRs, as you might imagine, was doubt and defensiveness almost. And again, if you go back to that episode with Rachel, you'll realize that she also had the same reaction for very similar reasons, right? This is not how I was taught. And for me, especially with regards to Chinese, I was particularly defensive and particularly doubtful about TPRs working with Chinese, because I had in my mind this idea that Chinese, no matter what, is hard work and requires suffering. It's a hard language. It was kept intentionally difficult to learn. Literacy was not a priority in Chinese until like universal literacy in Chinese was not a priority until literally last century. And so if you're gonna learn Chinese, you gotta be prepared to suffer, man. And so all of this like easy way out, just comprehend what you're saying, and it'll be fine. Learn a language like a baby learns a language, which is really kind of like a way to simplify the philosophy behind comprehensible input. To me, that was kind of like, this is just another example of people who don't understand Chinese, who are trying to capitalize on how trendy and sexy it is, and trying to make it really accessible and possible for everyone to learn, because no one wants to do the hard work, but I know how to do the hard work, and so y'all don't understand. I was just very defensive, kind of arrogant about all of this, but really just doubtful. There is a certain elitism, I feel, within the Chinese learning community when it comes to the methodologies that are used to learn Chinese. I think people who learn Chinese are somewhat protective of our space. Because, again, most of us were educated using legacy methods, which does require a lot of monotonous, hard, painstaking work, a lot of character memorizing, a lot of 听写, a lot of things that are just like just not fun, and right, and so it's kind of like you go through the training, you cut your teeth, and then anyone who kind of waltzes in is just like, wait, you don't actually have to do that. There's a much easier way. You're like, what? You're very protective of that space, and you're instantly doubtful of anyone who claims that like Chinese is easier to learn than what has been defined by your own experience. And I feel like in part that protectionist sort of outlook to things is somewhat justified, if only because nowadays there's just so much like junk that tries to come into that space, right? Again, it's because Chinese nowadays is, trendy, and people are trying to capitalize this and making all these like apps and websites and podcasts, whatever, YouTube videos that, like I mentioned a couple episodes back, are just not, cool, but not effective. And so again, I don't think it's wrong to be protective of that space. And with that protective outlook comes this certain doubt. And so I think that was what I was kind of projecting when I had first looked into TPRS. But what's also important is that, I'm a Chinese, I still consider myself a Chinese learner. But as a Chinese teacher, I also need to acknowledge that gatekeeping is not my job. In fact, it's kind of the opposite of my job. And accessibility to learning Chinese, I think in the years that I've been teaching it, has come from being something that's kind of like, well, if you get it, you get it. If you don't, you don't, to something that has become a core part of my teaching philosophy. which was not an intentional, act of altruism. I think it wasn't like I sat down one day and I was just like, Chinese ought to be accessible to everyone, and everyone should be able to. I don't think I came to that conclusion really because I was coming from a place of altruism, but really it was out of this, out of experience and being in a place where I realized that like legacy methods really aren't accessible to most students, really don't make Chinese accessible to most students. And it's not enough to just be like, well, if legacy methods, if the way that Chinese has been taught for thousands of years doesn't work for you, well, then that means that Chinese is not for you. I found myself deeply uncomfortable with that idea the more and more I tried to fall in line with it. And so as a result, and it just didn't make sense to me on the other hand, that like, Chinese being, again, the language of business and it's like a capitalistic skill almost, so to speak, right? A lot of people learn Chinese so that they can make money. And there's something inherently unjust about saying that like this tool is off limits to a certain subset of people because we refuse to change how we teach it. And so for those reasons, I was the logical conclusion, the logical progression to me developing my philosophy as a Chinese teacher is one that is centered around accessibility. And so as a result, this sort of like elitist gatekeeping that I used to employ in my own personal life because I was so protective of my own experiences and the amount of hard work that I put into learning Chinese, that's something that couldn't really come into play anymore when I, as I started, becoming more invested in my teaching. You can say, I feel like, again, if you're listening to this and you're a Chinese learner at this point, you're probably like, not a teenager. You've probably been learning it for quite some time and you were probably taught using legacy methods. And so I feel like, I came from that same place too. And I think it's a hard transition to make, to say that like I learned it this way, but not everyone has to, right? I worked hard to learn it, but that shouldn't be the case for everyone. I was very much like a you suffer and learn the language or you die sort of a teacher when I first began, because again, that's how I was taught. It was kind of like, I don't think I ever had a teacher who outrightly said that, but it definitely was that sort of, whether or not your classmates sort of like propagated that or it was just this untold rule, the sort of like survival of the fittest outlook to it. But as I was teaching, I realized exactly how unsustainable that philosophy was. From the most like simple things, right? You give a vocabulary quiz, right? There's a new chapter, you give a vocabulary quiz at the beginning of the chapter because like obviously you can't really move on to grammar unless you know how to read the characters in the vocabulary for that chapter. Vocabulary quizzes, in my opinion, are as like straightforward as it gets, right? You get a list and you memorize what's on the list, and then the test is exactly like the list but without the English part. Or no, without the Chinese part, and just fill in the characters, like standard vocabulary quiz. In my mind, this is like requires very little, if any, critical thinking, the most straightforward thing ever, right? You really cannot mess this up unless you don't study. What happened? Half my kids didn't study. Not only did they not study, they did not even like look at the vocabulary list, let alone like practice writing the characters or all the things you actually have to do in order to do on a quiz. Half your kids fail, right? Because of this. And then the other half of kids who like actually try, you find out they're spending hours and hours and hours to memorize this list, and it's like kind of killing them, right? And when I ran into this problem like literally first week that I started teaching, and I was just baffled because like memorizing vocabulary to me was the most straightforward thing ever. Like I said, you don't need to be a genius, you just need to work hard at it. And when I realized that like even this most basic tenet, or what in my mind was this most basic tenet of like, here's a vocabulary list, you memorize it, just work hard, stuff it in your brain, take the quiz, you're good, right? I realized that baseline had to be lowered. My teaching quickly turned into this like race to the bottom, right? In my reference, I'd visited classrooms where like I saw students who like can memorize 30 words in just one day, right? Okay, if it takes one day for a class to memorize a list of 30 words, it's going to take my class 2 weeks. So 2 weeks it is. We're just going to spend 2 weeks drilling vocabulary. And so my pacing, just because I felt like I believe that was like the only way to learn or teach Chinese, because that was the only way I had ever seen other classrooms do it, and their results were so different from mine. I just figured, well, the only independent variable here is speed. And so I'll just have to slow everything down immensely. So you spend 2 weeks on the same set of vocabulary and you drill vocabulary writing, character writing in class. And it's like soul crushing for the kids because they're bored to death. And I'm bored to death, right? Not only was I bored, I was like so frustrated and I felt so ineffective. Like no one was having a good time. And it really, and as I was doing this, I was like taking shots at the dark to try to speed up the process. And basically I was having this like, mini existential crisis because everything I had known from experience about Chinese teaching, like the methodology did not yield the results that I was used to seeing, right? And so nothing made sense, right? Again, I had learned Chinese in a world where like, teacher professor would throw you a vocabulary list and everyone was just expected to memorize it, and they did, and then you come to my classrooms in my school and that just doesn't work, right? And you're just kind of like, like the formulas that you had so relied on don't seem to play out in this universe, and it's just confusing, right? And at the same time, I was like fending off parents who like didn't get my methodology. And that was hard too, because to be honest, like they didn't get my methodology. I didn't get my methodology either, right? Everything that I knew that was supposed to work wasn't working, right? This was a really frustrating, like, I would even say 3 or 4 years. 3 or 4 years of this, like, torturous, ridiculousness of not really knowing what I was doing. Because, again, it really was built off of this, like, everything that I knew and was taught just did not play by the same rules here. And so something had to change. So as all of this was happening, I was also, like, almost subconsciously starting to establish some like ground rules and philosophies for myself about what I wanted my students to ultimately get out of learning a language, right? This wasn't like I sat down and had like a come to Jesus moment with myself and really, because I really was just too like distressed to really think on that high a level. It was more kind of like me looking at noticing problems, and trying to figure out, okay, those problems are not things I want to happen. So what are the things that will prevent that from happening? And one of my core concerns, one of the biggest problems that I kept seeing was that knowing that learning a language, is a evolving process. It's an ongoing process. No one learns a thing and then like spits out a sentence that's absolutely correct. There's a lot of error that goes on. Even like I would say native speakers don't speak grammatically correctly 100% of the time. So if that's the case, then why in the world why in the world would we ever expect someone learning a language to like get something grammatically correct 100% of the time as well, especially if they're just starting to learn it, right? There's something about that doesn't make much sense. And so for me, one baseline that I established is language learning is not about getting the right answers, right? Because language in itself is not formulaic enough to just like plug and play stuff. It's not like, it's not like math, right? Although, I mean, I'm sure if you're a mathematician, you could probably argue against this, but language in itself, there's so much fluidity, and so much room for permissible error that, and on top of that, like, it's an ongoing process. And so if you understand that language learning is not about getting the right answers, the like 0 to 100% grading scheme makes less and less sense, right? And I realized this in a very like tangible way, because as I was grading quizzes that I was giving my kids, I was like, these are like free response quizzes, like rejoinders, whatever, right? Like, or translate the sentence, really basic stuff. I found myself doing some really ridiculous things, like taking off fractions of a point, like literally 1/16 of a point, because one stroke in one character was wrong, right? Which in the grand scheme of things really does not matter. But in my mind, it's like, this is not 100% correct. I cannot award this the same amount of credit that I would to an answer that had that one little stroke correct, because it's not correct. It's not 100%. Therefore, you get points off. And so, it's, and as I was like taking off those like 1/16 of a point, all I could think to myself was like, this doesn't matter. Right? Does me taking off this fraction of point matter? No, it really doesn't. It doesn't communicate anything useful to the student except for the fact that they got something wrong, which is like, in the grand scheme of things, is not that big of a deal. And I'm really only taking the point off, or fractions of a point off, out of the principle of the thing. it was just this like slow descent into insanity, trying to reconcile like this 0 to 100, absolutely correct, trying to reconcile this mindset with the inherent imperfection that is learning language, and just like starting to, go crazy about it. And so, I found myself going back to the basics, right? What really matters when you're learning a language. And language learning is something that needs to be so self-motivated, particularly if you're in a cultural or social context where being monolingual is expected, and being bilingual, multilingual is like a cute bonus. Self-motivation is key to learning a language. And so all I could think about was, how do I get, in the absence of this sort of like point grabbing, right? If it's not reasonable to have kids, assess themselves or determine their proficiency or their performance in a class by this 0 to 100 scale, which doesn't make sense for language learning. How then do you get kids to pursue excellence, pursue a high level of achievement in a language for its own sake and not because it's required of them? The answer to this is really easy, really obvious. You pursue excellence in something because you're interested in it. You're engaged in it. You're personally invested in it. And those things are so integral to keeping yourself motivated when learning a language. And those are also things that are so easy to talk up and emphasize the importance of, like engagement, interest, blah, 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 and actually really hard to implement and foster on a practical scale. And so I was kind of at this impasse, right? Like, the students are not at a point where they have some sort of internal or external motivation to learn the language. I have issues with, I was not sure how to like really motivate kids to foster that interest for themselves within my classroom. And so in the absence of strategies that actually worked, why not TPRS, right? And TPRS, it was the importance of TPRS initially was more kind of like, I need a classroom routine that actually worked. I needed someone to create tests that made sense and assessments that made sense. It came out of that, a very practical concern rather than any concern about motivation and interest and engagement. But as I did more and more of it, I realized exactly that the TPRS's real charm, real value really lies in how it fosters engagement and investment in really unexpected ways. And I'll get to that very, very soon. And so anyway, now that we've said all of that, what exactly does TPRS look like? TPRS basically works in 3 stages. So the first stage is that you present new words, new target words, and you establish their meaning. And the way you establish your meaning can be really straightforward. Like some teachers will like draw pictures and say like, say one of the phrases or the vocab words is like, getting in the car. You draw a picture of someone getting in the car and you present the word in the target language or the phrase in target language that describes getting in the car. Like, so you spend a chunk of time, presenting words and defining their meaning. Sometimes you can just say, 上车 just means getting in the car. Like, if you can use English and it's the most efficient way to define something, why not, right? That's probably sacrilege in some like people's minds, but to be honest, it's effective and it's not going to break it's not going to break the sanctity of the language classroom, at least in my opinion. So that's the first phase. Second phase is telling a story using those words, which is really just a way of contextualizing the words in different ways, repetitively, in a way that is engaging. So you tell a story, you make up a story, oftentimes with the students together, right? We call this asking the story. And so like, for example, if you're establishing a main character, you ask the students like, what's the main character's name? And they give you names, right? And so it's a way to keep them engaged. But really the crux of it is that you contextualize the words and these new target words. So that's the second phase. And the third phase is that you give a reading that oftentimes is based off of that story, and it uses, again, those target words. And so it really, at its, there's a lot of other fancy accoutrements that can kind of be linked to that 3-phase sort of system, but at its very core, TPRS really revolves around those 3 phases. And so I will link to an article from Fluent U, which is a really great resource for both language teaching and language learning, that really kind of lays it out very, very well about what TPRS is all about, as well as a video of TPRS being used in a beginner Chinese classroom. Like when I mean beginner, it's like literally first day of Chinese. You'll be impressed. So it's better something that's more effectively shown rather than described. But anyway, the crux of TPRS is that when you present this new material, contextualization is super important, and repetition is super important. And so one method that comes up a lot with TPRS is a method we call circling, right? And so it's in circling, you kind of like repeatedly ask questions to kind of confirm the meaning of something. So an example of this is let's say something really simple, right? Is Benny a dog? Yes, Benny is a dog. Is Benny a cat? No, Benny is not a cat. Is Benny a dog or a cat? Benny is a dog. Is Benny a rabbit? No, Benny is not a rabbit. What is Benny? Benny is a dog. And so those very, if again, the target word there is the word dog, you can really firmly establish meaning of that word in the target language just from asking those repetitive questions. And so in that sense, it gives students that circling, gives students multiple opportunities to kind of latch onto the meaning of that word in different contexts. It's really great, and it differentiates itself almost in a way because, students who are grasping onto the meaning of that word right away, they're still able to catch different usages of that word as you continue to circle. And your students who are not, who haven't really caught onto it yet, they are given multiple opportunities to catch onto it. So it's really cool. It's really, really simple. But that kind of that's kind of why it's kind of brilliant that this method exists. So anyway, as I was looking to implement this, again, I was coming from a place of deep existential angst. I started like any good millennial teacher would, and as I looked on the internet, started with blogs. There's a great blog that is called literally TPRS Questions and Answers. It's by a Spanish teacher called Chris Stoltz. And I mostly stumbled on this blog initially because my big question with TPRS was with grading, namely how to do tests, which he has a really great post that I just keep going back to about how he does assessments. I'll talk about assessments in a little bit, but his blog then linked to post by Terry Waltz and then later Diane Neubauer. And both those people, Terry Waltz has written a book for Chinese teaching using TPRS. If there were ever a quote unquote authority on TPRS for Chinese, I would say Terry Waltz is your girl. She's amazing. And Diane Neubauer as well has her own blog, TPRS for Chinese, that I also keep referencing. Those two teachers are kind of like the 大师, the two masters of TPRS for Chinese, and I always reference back to them. And the reason why there's only, again, like I said, TPRS is a huge field, but for Chinese, the playing field gets to be a little bit smaller. Terry Waltz and Diane Neubauer, I'd say, are kind of like your two, they've done it for a long time. They've really invested a lot of time and research into it, and their methodology really does work. And so if you're again a Chinese teacher, start with their work and just branch off from there. And so in my experience, having implemented it for a couple months now, I can see why TPRS would actually be easier to implement for Chinese than it would be for your FIGS languages, your French, Italian, German, Spanish, in some ways, and harder in others, right? It's easier because in Chinese, you don't have to worry about verb conjugations and concrete grammar rules. And that's something that I've seen FIGS language teachers kind of angst a little bit about. One common question, especially for Spanish teachers, is how do you teach the difference between the imperfect and the subjunctive when you're talking about verb tenses? I think I got that right. My 6 years of Spanish in high school is clearly deteriorating. Things like that, right? The little nuances that traditionally have been taught with just straight, direct grammar instruction. How do you convey those nuances using TPRS, which is largely done in L2, which is largely done in the target language? How do you kind of adapt those things to a TPRS approach, right? Chinese, you don't really have to worry about that as much because, again, like I mentioned before, Chinese grammar tends to be kind of fluid, at least from a surface level perspective, and there's not as much real nitty gritty. And if you ask most Chinese people, even Chinese heritage speakers, you ask them about Chinese grammar, they'll be like, what Chinese grammar? It does feel very instinctive, and TPRS builds straight into that instinct. And so if you're a teacher and you're a native speaker of Chinese and you're the best, and you believe that the best way to instill grammar in your students is to build in that instinct, it will happen with TPRS. I have students now who I've only been using TPRS for literally less than a year. And I have students now who will say to me, that doesn't sound right grammatically in Chinese. It sounds weird. Don't know why, but it sounds weird. And the reason why it sounds weird to them is because they haven't heard an actual real live human speaking Chinese say it that way before, which is how we, as native Chinese speakers also determine whether or not something quote unquote sounds weird. So that instinct is being built in when you use TPRS for Chinese because of that comprehensible input approach, because they're getting so much Chinese that they understand. They're getting like fire hose with that Chinese that they are starting to establish a sense of what sounds right and what doesn't. And that is like the most magical, amazing thing ever. So in that sense, TPRS for Chinese, it makes total sense to be using something like TPRS rather than legacy methods. However, TPRS can be harder for Chinese than it is for Fig languages because the R in TPRS stands for reading. In Fig's languages, the transition between spoken to written language is very, very direct because with those languages, what you hear is what you see, and what you see is what you get. Basically, what I mean by that is that, like, if you because those are phonetic languages, right? If you hear the word perro in Spanish and you see on a screen PERRO, right? And you've associated the sound of that word with the meaning of dog. When you see that word, you will also associate without much, really much mental gymnastics that also means dog. In Chinese, this doesn't really happen because characters are not linked to their sound, right? Characters offer very little, if any, indication as to what the word sounds like. And so if you have students who first encounter a word just by hearing what it sounds like, and then you suddenly go to characters, the connection, there is no direct connection that they can make instinctively. And so given that, the logical conclusion is that in order to read any characters, you must memorize characters, right? So this is kind of like where the TPRS-ness, the magic kind of stops, because you're like, well, if they can read anything, you still have to give them a list of characters and tell them to memorize it and do some sort of word association, whatever. But rote memorization of characters is not TPRS. Rote memorization of really anything is not TPRS. And so if you just assume that rote memorization is not allowed as a teacher, how do you teach kids to read Chinese? How do you teach kids to make that jump? Terry Waltz developed this thing called cold character reading, which is kind of brilliant. It's really, really simple and almost seems like, nah, this can't possibly work. So basically what she says is that, like, she noticed that students recognize patterns and associate sound with sight as long as they have enough repetitions of those characters, right? So basically you tell the story in Chinese, like orally, right? So they hear the words, they associate sound with meaning, and then you present a text version of that story that minimizes the number of unique characters or words, but maximizes the number of occurrences of the same characters, right? So in doing so, you kind of like, so for instance, I'm just gonna go back to the word go. I don't know why I keep saying that, but like, say that like the kids know that go, that sound means dog, but they don't know that the character, if you can remember what the character looks like, that character sounds like go, which therefore means dog. So after you're done with your story, you present a written text that presents the character go many times. Then you read the story out loud with the kids, and they will learn to associate the sound with the character they see up on the screen. The way that I've done this in my classroom is that I start reading out loud, and I tell the kids, you may read out loud with me. You don't have to right away, but you should jump in whenever you feel comfortable. And then after there's a certain, after that starts kind of rolling, I drop out, and the kids start being able to read what's on the screen on their own. And again, to remind you, there at no point have the kids ever been given like a vocabulary list. They have not been shown a list of words with pinyin. They have not sat down and memorized a list of words in order to know what the characters mean. They pick it up naturally. To which, again, if you've never experienced this firsthand, you'd be like, that doesn't happen. And it actually does. And I realized I had actually experienced this firsthand when I was really little, like 10 years old little. And when I went on family trips to Taiwan. And so watched a lot of TV when I was in Taiwan, when I was a little kid, a lot of cartoons. And in Taiwan, all TV shows are subtitled in Chinese. This is, in part to like different dialects and whatever. It's just a standard. And so if you watch TV, there are subtitles, Chinese subtitles to everything. And when I watched TV, I realized that I was learning how to read certain characters, not everything, but certain high frequency characters by associating what I was hearing with what I was seeing at the bottom of the screen, right? And again, these are not like, it's not as if I could read all the characters and subtitles just from associating the words. It was only high frequency words, like words like 我, which I didn't know how to read before, words like 你, 可以, 是, ma, things like that, words that keep coming up again and again without anyone straight up telling me. Now, obviously, I already knew what those words meant because as a heritage speaker, like those are, if they're high frequency in speech and listening, words I already knew. But I learned to recognize those characters because they kept occurring again and again, and my 9-year-old brain could connect the sound I was hearing with the characters on the screen. And so, I don't know. I think that if you're skeptical about how cold character reading works, take it from me. I was cold character reading in a sense when I was 9 years old and watching Taiwanese TV. And it actually does work. And I didn't realize this until I started implementing this in my classroom. I was trying to figure out why in the world, where is this magic coming from? And I realized, no, it's just how your brain works. It's cool. The other challenge that I met when I was adopting TPRS this year was working with my old textbooks, my current materials. When you look at TPRS and you've been a legacy method teacher for a while, it seems like there's a lot of overhead work that is involved. Basically, TPRS works really, really well if you're not tied to a textbook. You'll see a lot of TPRS teachers just like they say, oh, what textbook do you use? Oh, I make my own materials. Like, oh, or we just pick a novel and we read it for the higher level classes. And again, if you're a legacy method teacher and you're very reliant on textbooks, that's super scary. But and I was definitely scared of that as well. And I was just kind of like, the text, I'm just starting out. I'll use the textbook anyway as kind of like a way to, as kind of like a crutch, to help me out. But the more I taught, the more I realized that the textbook was actually seriously hindering me, and not helping me at all. It was really getting in the way, and I ended up having to make more work for myself as a result of using the textbook. And the real reason for that is because of vocabulary lists. Vocabulary lists in legacy textbooks tend to be very, very long and contain a lot of low frequency vocabulary, right? The prime example of this is like if you have a chapter on like ordering food at a restaurant, there's like a bajillion food names on that vocabulary list that you at one point I probably had to suffer through memorizing how to write and all that great, terrible stuff. And those are all words that you will probably will never have to handwrite, like in all practicality ever. And two, are not words that come up all that often. And so a lot of the vocabulary lists that are built into textbooks are just very very long and contain a lot of low frequency vocabulary. And it's really hard to build a story that incorporates that. You end up pulling bits and pieces out of different chapters to build a story that, doesn't just consist of one person going to the grocery store and buying an insane amount of vegetables just so you can circle this low frequency vocabulary. It just didn't make any sense. And so as a result, you end up using the textbook extremely infrequently just because it gets in the way of what you're doing. And I found myself getting to that point pretty quickly as I was trying to make these stories and keep them like in a voice that made sense. One of the textbooks that I use in my high school classes that I used to really like, and it seemed to work really, really well for me in previous years, is called Encounters. It's actually a pretty new textbook. I think it was published in late 2000s, which I guess in this is considered pretty new for in textbook land. I used to really like this textbook a whole lot because it had a lot of authentic materials. It had this really rich suite of multimedia resources, lots of video, just really good stuff. But it ended up being really frustrating to work with, and I didn't really understand why until I did a little of digging, and I realized that Encounters is what we call a task-based language teaching textbook instead of a TPRS sort of textbook. And when task-based language teaching is involved, it really basically what that looks like is it's your classic, you're the train conductor, I'm a passenger, and I need to buy a train ticket from you. Okay, go. Like it's a very role play heavy sort of textbook. It didn't have any vocabulary list at all, but it also didn't have a lot of contextualized language either. It was just a lot of low frequency vocabulary, right? Like in any given chapter, it'd be like, here are all the words you could possibly need to know in order to make every dish on a Chinese restaurant menu, but we're not going to cover like high frequency things like 听见 or 看过, like those resultative complements, until like much later down the line. And so the sequential progress of this didn't make a lot of sense. I mean, to its credit, like the rich suite of multimedia resources I was talking about before, I still use that for what we call like movie talk or picture talk activities, which is basically where like you show a picture or show a movie clip and then you do circling with that as kind of like a visual base to kind of guide the discussion. So I use encounters for that, but so far I've actually just been very frustrated to try to use I mean, this makes sense, right? It's two totally different teaching approaches, and they just don't gel well together. So I think if you're a teacher and you're very textbook reliant like I was, it's kind of like a safety net. You will find, and I'm usually the last person to say this because I like to make my work as simple for me as possible, you will find very quickly that the textbook will get in the way and you're much better off making your own materials. Seriously. If I were to do this over again, I would just have my kids not have textbooks whatsoever. Probably do a novel for my higher level classes, a novel specifically written for TPRS because those do exist. And just do my own thing, because really the textbook just gets in the way. So didn't think I'd ever say that, but I'm a strong believer in that now. So anyway, it's been about one semester and a little more than a semester, and basically in my classroom, TPS has changed everything for the better, which is not that high of a compliment because the baseline was not that high to begin with. I don't have much to miss about how I used to do things, but overall, I'm really happy with how TPRS has worked. And I think, again, if you're a teacher, that's something, me saying that is something that you should probably, take some stake in, because I'm not, it's not as if this is my first semester doing it, and it's not as if I was doing a perfect job at it. So even like the littlest bit of TPRS I found, even TPRS done poorly or with a notable lack of experience amateurishly, like I am doing it, makes a huge difference. And so you should be encouraged by that. Doing bad TPRS a lot of the times is better than doing no TPRS at all. That's a very strong statement to make, but as a person who did both legacy methods and tried every trick in the book that was supposed to work, and then switched over to a method that I had no experience in and was literally just doing based off of what I was gleaning from blogs and podcasts, the results do speak for themselves. What makes the success particularly striking is how high the level of engagement is in my classes. I surprised myself with this, but it makes sense. What keeps kids engaged? And I think this is a big question that is really why I want to discuss TPRS in the first place, because what people think keeps students engaged in learning a language oftentimes just devolves into you're interested in the culture, or random accessories associated with the language, random accoutrements associated with the language, or or entertainment, media. Or even how engaging or funny or nice the teacher is, right? Again, like I said before, the discussion surrounding engagement, keeping the students engaged, tends to be pretty easy to talk up. It's really easy to kind of wax poetic about how important it is to make sure your kids are interested and personally invested in what you're learning in, but it's super hard to really implement in a meaningful way. I was really, and I still am very skeptical of the idea that Chinese culture alone is enough to draw students into learning Chinese. There's a couple reasons for that. But the main crux of the reasons that I'll explain a little later on is that the attraction to Chinese culture is not universal whatsoever. And so you cannot rely on being able to foster an interest in Chinese culture in order to keep your students motivated to learn this language. But what is universal? What keeps all students motivated? Not just culture. What keeps all students wanting to do more and to work harder and to encourage them? And that thing is tangible success, right? Personal success drives students forward. It's the magic in the words I actually understood that, which I love hearing because it's happening more and more in my classroom, and it's what keeps students wanting to learn more. It's knowing that they have succeeded before that will want them to continue going, because it shows, it's a testament that they will continue to succeed and that this is a worthwhile journey to go on. Students need constant reassurance that they're doing okay, particularly high school students, particularly middle school students. And this is tricky to implement because, again, like I said before, a lot about language learning is about getting stuff wrong and learning from those mistakes. And so the way in which that they are approaching their errors and the way that they are encountering their successes is really, really important. They need to know that they're doing okay, and they need to feel a sense of security. And I'm constantly reminding myself that the reason why TPRS works is because it is helping students feel secure. It's helping them feel like they're doing okay. And so, with all the stuff that goes on with TPRS, all the things you can do, I think the reason why TPRS can succeed and keep students motivated really hinges on that. Something really simple that really surprised me that happened as a direct result of TPRS is how I was able to teach how to answer yes or no questions in Chinese, which sounds like a really, really, really straightforward thing in literally any other language. But the thing about yes or no questions in Chinese is that there is not really... This is like a testament to how ridiculous Chinese is. There's not really a word for yes or no in Chinese. There is 是 and there is 不, or if you're really fancy, there is 是 and there is 否. But like in all practical usage, if you answer a yes or no question using 是 or 不, a lot of times they'll sound really awkward and unnatural. And so one thing that I kind of impress upon my students is that to not get into the habit of thinking that there is a word for yes and there is a word for no in Chinese. How do you answer a yes or no question in Chinese? The way you answer it is that you use the verb in the sentence to answer yes or no. And you can do this in literally any other language as well. It just sounds a little bit inefficient because in those languages you do have a word for yes or no. So it's kind of like, if the question was, is Sally here today? You wouldn't say yes, Sally is here. Or you would say, no, Sally isn't here. You would say, if someone asks, is Sally here today? You would say, Sally is here, or Sally is not here. Sally 今天在不在? 她在. 她不在. So you would directly use the verb as a means to answering a yes or no question, which then means that like the way you answer a yes or no question changes depending on what verb is being used. 你今天去学校吗? 我去了. 我不去. In that case, the yes and the no hinges on the verb in the sentence, which is 去, to go. What was interesting is that like I taught this to my 6th grade class, one of my youngest classes, almost unintentionally. When I was just trying to take attendance, right? I have a lot of kids in the class. Compared to this week, I have 17 kids in that class, which for my classes is kind of huge. And so to do attendance quickly, all I just asked, because they're in the same classes together all day long, I just ask kids, is so-and-so here today? 今天 Ella 在吗? 她在. 她不在. And they started answering back to me in that grammatically correctly using the verb rather than just say 是 or 不是. Which is really, really cool to me because I feel like if you were to try to teach that, like that kind of absence of yes, a word for yes and no in explicit grammar instruction, you're going to be talking about that for a long time. It's going to sound super confusing, right? But my 6th graders picked up on this almost instantly because they heard examples of it. They heard it circled, over and over again every day as a part of their routine. And as a result, they learned this really important component of grammar in Chinese without really even having to think about it, which to me was just super cool. Even my 5th grade class, which is like my only non-upper school class, it's my hardest class, in part because of how infrequently we meet. So we meet like twice a week, 30 minutes each on a Monday and a Friday, first thing in the morning. It's like worst possible time ever. And on top of that, and it's just like a tricky class at a really tricky age. And so as a means of like classroom management, I assign seats to them. They don't have assigned seats because I move the chairs around. But I assign seats to them by like sticking a card with a little picture of an animal and the name of the animal in Chinese characters on each chair. And then as they come in, I pass out a card that matches to one of the chairs. And so they find their seat for that day. It just makes things easier for me because, the kids, having kids pick their own seats at that age is like asking for trouble. And I don't want to deal with like, assigning seats and then being constantly asked, Miss Liu, when can we change seats? So it was easy. A lot of decisions I make in terms of teaching is to make my life easier, if you haven't noticed. But I used that as a way because I needed to get the cards back from the kids. I didn't just want to collect them. So the way I collect them is that I would ask, once they were all seated, I'd ask, okay, who's the tiger? And then I start circling around those words. Who's the tiger? Is Daniel the tiger? Is Daniel the tiger or the rabbit? What is Daniel? Daniel's the rabbit, isn't he? No? Daniel's the tiger? Then who's the rabbit? And so that is like a whole ton of vocabulary. So you have all these animal names, right? And then you have this like shi, as in terms of like is or is not, like the identity of something. And I'm just teaching this just by like by collecting my seating cards back. And so, what's great about both these examples is how effortless they are, right? They're just a part of the essential daily functioning of a classroom. And so, what this shows is that repetition and routine are super key. What do kids remember? They remember stuff that comes up frequently and is predictable and is part of a routine. And so if that's what they remember, you might as well employ that to help you, employ that to deliver new words to them as a means of communicating language. As far as storytelling is concerned, because that's the S part of TPRS, it's been super effective for my middle school classes. Even like my most challenging class has grown immensely in the past semester because putting together a story, asking them the story is really good at keeping them engaged. That said, I feel like the efficacy of storytelling as a model in TPRS, as a device to deliver material, is largely rooted in how engaging it is, not necessarily because it's the best or the only way to contextualize vocabulary. Because starting from like 10th grade onwards, I noticed that the storytelling thing doesn't capture their interest nearly as much. And so if their interest is lost, then you got to try something else, because interest and engagement is everything with this. And so the stories are great because they keep only as far as they are useful for keeping kids engaged. Once they stop being engaging, they're no longer all that useful for delivering material. And so we do stories in middle school and it's awesome. And they're super engaged. They're not at that age where they think it's like babyish, or they do try like to do crazy things with it. With my older kids, it gets a little dry, a little unnatural, or it gets a little out of control because they get bored. So for those classes, I've been using more like movie talk, picture talk, or like discussion format stuff to contextualize words. I mentioned a little bit previously what movie talk and picture talk are. Basically, you have a movie clip or a video clip that you like continually pause and you discuss like, what is happening in the video, and you contextualize vocabulary and circle in that way. Very similar to how you would do it for the story, but it's really just, describing and discussing what's going on, what they see. In other words, you're basically wrapping this discussion / oral practice around a certain central topic where you can easily weave in the target vocabulary. And in some cases, using visuals like a movie or a picture to supplement and aid the discussion. This is challenging because it tends to be a lot less predictable than when you have a story, because with a story, you know how everything's going to go. And it runs the risk of veering off track. And when you veer off track, it gets harder to kind of hammer in the target vocabulary. But honestly, I'm okay with that trade-off because, again, the stories aren't really doing, the job of keeping them engaged in those older grades. And these discussions really do. And so I'll take that over, the small sacrifices I'm making and not being able to really hammer in that vocabulary. And I've also noticed that at those higher levels, you really don't need to circle as much. It's really, even I think you can make the argument. I feel like I've seen a lot of Chinese teachers make this argument. I'm not sure if I'd agree with it, but some Chinese teachers say that TPRS isn't effective for higher levels at all. And I'd say, I think the story part isn't effective for it, but the methodology and the spirit behind it, the circling is still highly effective. And so it just depends on the medium. Reading and writing have been interesting. I haven't had a single vocabulary quiz this year because cold character reading works really well. But only with sufficient at-home practice, because in the end, CCR, cold character reading, is still a kind of passive memorization when it comes to Chinese. I don't know if this would be frowned upon by other TPRS teachers. This idea of like, what I do with my kids is that like when I have a reading, I have them out on PowerPoints and I give them all a link to the PowerPoint, and their job at home is to practice reading that out loud. And the risk you run with that, and I've run into a case of this with like particularly precocious students who somehow end up reading it so much that they just memorize the entire text rather than reading it. So that's a problem. But I found that like assigning, quote unquote, assigning that at home practice, reading practice, to be pretty crucial to keep the class moving forward. If only because like if you just read through something once or twice, the gap in between classes is just so much time for them to kind of lose the passive memorization that they've gained from reading the characters in class in the first place. So they need to go home and review it and lock the characters in their brain. The problem that I'm encountering with this is that my kids struggle with accountability, and it's really hard to, establish that accountability without something tangible that they output, right? Like, the crux of homework is that the kids output stuff. There's written proof of their work, and TPRS does not really emphasize that written output or really any output at all. Unless it's really later down the line and it comes out naturally. And so there needs to be a certain kind of accountability that I've really struggled to kind of latch onto. My mind keeps coming back to practicing an instrument, because I think in the same way, when you're practicing an instrument, the results kind of come out. The results of your practice are, how you perform, just like the results of your practicing Chinese come out in how well you are reading when you come back to class the next day. But at the same time, I think with music teachers, they struggle with the same accountability issues. And I know this firsthand as a music student, as an instrumentalist student who like did not practice, and teachers were super frustrated with me because I did not practice. And I'm just like, hey, if you're a music teacher and you have strategies for this, I would really love to hear what you have to say about that. I think I feel like at the end of the day, though, that like, assigning kids to practice reading something out loud as a quote unquote homework is a lot more reasonable and a lot less painful than memorizing vocabulary lists, but it just feels less concrete. And motivating kids, regardless of their ability to generate the activation energy to practice, no matter how hard or easy the task is challenging, right? So again, it doesn't matter. Like I could be like, read this one sentence. That's all. To have them assign that for me. And there'll still be kids who struggle to kind of work up the motivation to do that, because really, and anyone who's human could probably relate to this. But it really is a matter of working up that activation energy to sit down, open up that PowerPoint and practice a little bit. Just like you sit down and open up your piano to practice for a little bit. It's really that activation energy. So again, I feel like instrumentalist teachers, music teachers are probably the masters of having to deal with this problem. So if you're a music teacher or an instrumentalist, holla at me. All right. Writing has been interesting. I honestly feel that overemphasizing handwriting by memory is kind of a waste of time, which is kind of sacrilegious in the world of teaching Chinese, because so much energy is spent in ensuring that students are able to write characters by memory by hand. In all honesty, I'm just like, for students, I really feel like this is not worth the time. If only because like even native speakers nowadays, if they forget how to write a character, they just open up their smartphone and look it up and they write it down. But that doesn't like negate the problem that like high frequency words like 我 and 是, like you still kind of need to be able to write those for practical reasons. Or even if you were to strip it down even a little more, right? Like the reason why native speakers can, like, if they just forget how to write a character, they can just look it up really quickly and then, oh, that's how you write it, is because it's not that they have memorized a character at one point in their lives and really sat down and drilled it in their heads. It's really because like they've written so many other characters that the prospect of learning to write a new character is not all that daunting. And so it's really not as much about memorizing how to write each individual character from memory as much as it is learning the discipline of how writing characters works and being able to maximize those skills and spread them out to new characters when you encounter them. I still want to avoid throwing lists of words at kids, even if they're like a list of high frequency words. I want to avoid being like, having to throw a list at them and just say, memorize this. And I like to keep this as organic as possible. One thing that I've kind of used, I'm still on the fence on whether or not I like this, but I feel like it kind of works, is that I just have kids copy over the stories by hand. This is preferable, I feel, to just having copying over individual characters over and over and over and over again, because I found that really doesn't work. There are many creative ways to weasel your way out of that. My personal favorite being, if you have like a line of like, one character they have to write like 25 times, what kids will do is that they'll write the first character in each box, and then write the they'll write the first stroke in each box, and then write the second stroke in each box, and go on like that. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, what a colossal waste of time. But they'll do that because it's faster and easier, and it also like teaches them nothing. So yeah. I feel like having them write the characters by hand, copy over the characters by hand in context to something that they have read before and are familiar with and know what it sounds like and know what it means, that has marginally more value than just having them copy over characters. I think it's the fruits of that have really shown when I have them do like a timed writing where I ask them to retell the story in writing, and they're able to kind of do so because they've had the muscle memory, at least, of writing a version of that story before. But at the same time, having them copy over stories does also feel like busy work. I've tried to keep it engaging by time, but doing it in class, not assigning it as homework because that's just going to be awful. Doing it in class and then timing it, and that's kind of fun. It's been a positive experience, but I also can't help but feel like that's a bad use of class time. I mean, I've given myself a little permission over the past week because it's the week before Christmas break, but for my 7th grade class, they literally spent like 2 whole class periods copying over one story, and I'm just like, is this really the best use of time? And so, yeah, I'm still kind of on the fence with this. I feel like with TPRS, with writing, handwriting in particular, this is something that is going to be super challenging, or not super challenging, but just kind of an obstacle for Chinese because, the transition from input to output with languages with an actual alphabet tends to be a little bit easier because there's an alphabet. In Chinese, that writing in characters is a substantial hurdle, and trying to really organically make that process organic is challenging. And so still reading all the blogs, all the books on that, still trying to figure out what works best with my classroom. Some other challenges that keep coming up are the issue with grading work, and this is kind of like a happy challenge, because I'm now at a point where it's really tempting to actually not grade anything because the kids are learning stuff and motivated without the threat of grades. This is something that like I really struggled with for the first 4 to 5 years of my career because it kind of felt like I couldn't get kids to do anything unless I threatened them with grades, and I really hated grading stuff because again it like turned into that whole like taking off 1/16 of a point for something, and it's like slow descent into insanity, whatever. So now this is a good sort of challenge. This is a good sort of problem because at a point where I could technically run the class without having to grade anything and kids will still learn Chinese. Like, how amazing is that? So, but at the same time, grades exist for a reason, and they are supposed to be a helpful tool rather than a hindrance. And so now that I'm in a good juncture where I can now use grades as a helpful tool rather than a hindrance, how can we now use grades as a true indicator of progress rather than, a motivator or a demotivator or a threat? And how can we especially use grades as a way to demonstrate to parents who don't get to see what happened in the classroom every day, what happens in the classroom at all? There are really good arguments here to move to standards-based grading, which is something that I feel like a lot of educators have really been in support of, at least passively, but it's been hard to kind of transition to that because it really does require a system-wide overhaul, really does require an entire community buy-in to move from A, B, C, D, F to stuff that is standards-based, right? Stuff that is a more qualitative assessment as to how a student is doing in a class. TPRS, with all its rubrics, all of its descriptors, I think really lends itself well to that sort of grading, lends itself very poorly to this A, B, C, D, F sort of numeric style of grading. But, it's just like the textbook problem. It's like, these are the systems that exist. And so you kind of have to wrap your methodology around it until things change to adapt to you. But for now, right, as I am looking at, balancing my grade books, is that a term? Straighten out my grade book before the end of the semester next month. I'm constantly thinking about how I want grades to function, because again, for me, because I'm lazy. One of the important things about grades is that I really don't want to make more work for myself than is actually necessary. What I want is to establish a grading system that like runs really well and hums quietly in the background while I'm doing real stuff, and is helpful and doesn't create unnecessary busy work for both me as a teacher as well as a student. I don't want to like give quizzes or assignments that just feel very extraneous. Students still ask me now when I give them like writing things, they still ask me, is this being graded? And what I just tell them now is like, pretend like it is, and they'll still do a great job with it. I don't know, it's because like they're assuming that it is being graded or for other reasons, but I just don't want to be at a place where like, you know, things are working so well without me having to really grade or give grades for any assessments, and then I'm just like throwing out busy work and saying like, this is like, you know, just like a performance review at work, or like, you know, where you get observed in a classroom. I don't want this to be like a periodic sort of like thing. It just doesn't make sense to me. And so my dream system that I've yet to figure out, this is probably why I need to go to grad school. But like, I would love to have a grading system that just kind of hums along quietly in the background, does its job, and I don't really have to think about it. Just throw grades in based on the rubrics that I have already established and that the kids have buy-in for. Something really simple like that. I'd love to be able to create something like that. In terms of assessments, formative assessments have been super easy because they happen all the dang time. Comprehension checks are an integral part of making sure that the classroom runs smoothly. And comprehension checks are really just basically like things that you do, questions you ask, facial expressions that you make to ensure that everyone in your class understands what's going on. That's a formative assessment. Other things are like exit tickets, just simple set of questions that kind of give you data points to make sure that your kids are actually on track to where they're supposed to be. Summative assessments have been challenging. I've been doing a lot of time writing for this, but again, like I mentioned before, writing in Chinese in any sort of assessment form is challenging because of the inherent lexical structure of Chinese, in that there are characters and no alphabet. There are lots of cool possibilities that can exist for final exam sort of things. Last year, for their final exam, I kind of experimented with students creating and telling stories of their own, which was a lot of fun. I think the kids did a really good job of it. I think it worked out pretty okay. But in terms of like assessment standards, what I was grading them on, I think I didn't feel super secure on that. So I think with TPRS, there's a lot of room for like those end of year sort of like summative sort of things. It's just a matter of creating a grading structure that makes sense in all of it. Because I feel like a lot of the times, again, if you're in the classroom, the results do speak for themselves. I will always say that like the place where I learned the most Chinese was in Taiwan, where we didn't receive grades ever at all. And so that to me will always be proof that you can learn a language without the threat of grades as a stick, and can learn it through the motivation of wanting excellence for yourself, which is the carrot. And I really do see that in my classroom. But the thing is, the stick will need to exist in some form. And it's just a matter of making that stick make sense and be helpful. I don't know. This metaphor is starting to fail. But anyway, one last thing that I think is a concern that is shared by a lot of teachers is that TPRS on the teacher end of things is a very energy exhaustive sort of practice. It's a very teacher-centric teaching methodology. It's very, a teacher does a lot of talking, which is a lot of fun, but can also be really exhausting, especially if you're like me and you have like literally 7 classes in one day. It's a lot. Maintaining dynamism in the classroom requires a lot of practice. And it's not something that you'll get right away, but I don't think it's limited to personality types. I think you can be an introvert and still be a lively, engaging TPRS classroom teacher. One thing that is a real plus about this is that classroom management does kind of take care of itself if you do TPRS well, because the kids are so engaged in the learning process itself that like it's, you don't have to worry about, kids throwing spitballs at each other as you're lecturing from the front of the room, I think one thing that a lot of Chinese teachers are concerned about with TPRS is with language barrier. I feel like this is kind of a concern that comes up regardless of the language, the methodology you're using. But again, because TPRS is so teacher-centric, some teachers do have concerns with language barrier. I think the issue, it can be an issue, but it also is not an issue. I feel like Chinese native speakers actually have an advantage when it comes to this because there is so much target language coming from the teacher's side. But On the other hand, a really big part of TPRS is what we call teaching to the eyes, which is really like responding to students, being interactive to students, responding to how students are responding to what you're saying, and adapting yourself to that. And this is something that legacy methods, particularly Chinese legacy methods, don't really employ, just because if you're lecturing at the front of the room, I don't know, you could be lecturing to a bunch of rocks and it possibly could yield the same sort of output from the teacher. But anyway, I think from what I've seen, all in all, TPRS seems to be pretty popular and well received amongst native speaker Chinese teachers. But at the same time, I feel like if it's something that you're not used to, there is this tendency to overthink it when it's not really necessary. For me, TPRS has felt very, very natural. Does not require a lot of planning, to be honest. As long as you stick to the basic formula of introducing words, contextualizing the words orally, and then reading and writing those same words, I think you'll be okay. I'm definitely still a TPRS beginner, and there's tons and tons and tons and tons of things I should be doing better. But I realized that as long as I stick to this formula, good things happen, no matter how good or bad a job I might do. And so starting from that good place is really important. Everything else is just refining the process. And I think we'll leave the discussion for this week on that note. I think there's a lot more discussion to be had about, what TPRS actually means for language instruction as a whole and how we approach language learning, language teaching, as well as, hey, if you're a student like me, who learned language using legacy methods, and at this point you're still kind of like, yeah, this seems like a lot of thinking, a lot of work to rehaul a system that already works really well and at least taught me languages really well. I think there's a much larger discussion to be had about that. And I kind of want to save that for next week when we have a little more time. So that being said, thanks again for checking in on another episode of the Bad Chinese Teacher podcast. Show notes for this episode will be posted on the show website, which is badchineseteacher.com. This week's show notes are going to be pretty rich because, again, most of the TPRS resources are on blogs written by people that are way smarter than me, and if you're a teacher, you should definitely look into those. And if you're a student, you should look into those too, because I think they will help you in your language learning process and how you sort of contextualize your own learning. So badchineseteacher.com is where you'll find all of those. You also would do well to follow us on social media. On Instagram, we are at Bad Chinese Teacher. On Twitter, at Bad Chinese Pod. And on Facebook, just search us up, the Bad Chinese Teacher podcast. If you want to follow up with me, you can also find me on social media. On Instagram, I am at Patricia Liu. On Twitter, I am at Patricia SQ Liu. And you can keep up with my latest writing on blog.patricialiu.net. Okay, looking forward to continuing this discussion next week when I reemerge from my swamp of grad school applications. Pray for me, y'all. Hope your week goes really well, and have a Merry Christmas for those of you celebrating. Have a happy holidays. All right, see you next week. Bye-bye.